A dramatic monologue is a lyric poem which reveals a soul in action through the conversation of one character in a dramatic situation. The character is speaking to an identifiable but silent listener in a dramatic moment in the speaker's life. The circumstances surrounding the conversation, one side of which we hear as the dramatic monologue, are made clear by the implication in the poem, and a deep insight into the character of the speaker is given. With very few exceptions, the dramatic monologue is not a mediation nor a soliloquy, but it is a series of remarks, usually confessional, addressed either orally or in an epistolary form to another person or a group of listeners. These other figures, though they do not speak, are necessary to the understanding of the monologue. Although the dramatic monologue is a very old art form, it was brought to a high level by Robert Browning. The dramatic monologue represents a type of dramatic experimentation, but not something intended for theatrical presentation. There is always a particular speaker, a person spoken to, or of a particular place, and a specific dramatic situation. The usually cumulative characterization of the speaker presents a modern psychoanalysis of him. This form would therefore have three characteristics: 1. A speaker, 2. An audience, and 3. The occasions. As Browning exemplified this form, the dramatic monologue was one end of a conversation, and a definite speaker was present in a dramatic situation. Usually, a well-defined hero was present, though his character is understood entirely from the impression he produces upon the speaker. From Browning, the evolution of the dramatic monologue can be traced in the conflict between the poet and stage, between the writer and the stage artist. The form did not evolve in direct opposition to the play, but rather as a new and parallel aspect of dramatic art. The dramatic monologue derives its unity from the character of the speaker, and poems as different as Browning's Clive, Pippa's soliloquies in Pippa Passes, The Flight of the Duchess, and Tennyson's Ulysses are termed as the same literary form. Although my major focus would be on Browning, but even Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is a classic modern example of this type of literature. Robert Browning's works, as well as Eliot's masterpiece, present a wide range of character portraits, enabling them to discuss his own ideas freely while vividly presenting life as he sees it about him. The range is from the jealous brother in the soliloquy of the Spanish cloister, the completely worldly and sensuous bishop in The Bishop Orders His Tomb at St. Praxed's Church, begging his illegitimate sons to build him a tomb more elegant than that of his rival Gandalf. He can lie in the triumphant pride through the ages and hear the mass, see the bread and wine consecrated, and smell the human monk in Fra Lippi, caught sneaking out of a house of prostitution late at night, yet able to persuade the watch to spare him. As he expounds his theory of the purpose of art, to call to man's attention the beauties of nature he would otherwise miss, and to portray soul along with physical beauty. According to Fletcher, Browning's dramatic monologue is found to be represented as a literal transcript of words spoken, written, or thought at some definite time by some person who may be either historical or imaginary. But it is still different from a soliloquy. A soliloquy is a monologue addressed to oneself, thoughts spoken out loud without addressing another person. Theoretically, soliloquies are not dramatic monologues, but practically the two forms shade into each other, and in Browning's poetry, it is impossible to distinguish them sharply. After the Elizabethan era, the lyric gave way to poems like the Ode and Elegy, and for many years, the monologue did not develop. In Burns' love lyrics, one may observe, however, that the hearer becomes increasingly important. As examples, A Fond Kiss, My Bonnie Mary, and others of this type can be seen. Byron also used the form effectively, for example in The Maid of Athens. In the Victorian age, several characteristics contributed to the monologue's development. Among these, Howard enumerated the importance of sociology, the rise of subjectivity over objectivity, and the spread of democracy. He recognized that Tennyson used the form, but did not perfect it. If we look at Browning's most popular work, My Last Duchess, we'll see that it received its present title in the collected edition of Browning's poem in 1849. It is an early example of Browning's study of the Italian Renaissance, and is a milestone in the development of the dramatic monologue. Probably Alfonso II, 5th Duke of Ferrara, was the model for the portrait of the Duke in this poem. He had 3 wives, one of whom he lived with only 3 years, because of her death rumored to be by poison. Fra Pandolf and Claus of Innsbruck are imaginary artists. The Duke indirectly reveals his coldness of character by telling how bad his last Duchess was, and implying rather directly what is expected from his next Duchess. His last Duchess, on the other hand, had warmth, poise, and sympathy. The scene is the negotiation between the Duke and the envoy for his next Duchess. In any case, the Duke in this poem prides himself on being magnanimous as he allows the envoy to sit and look at his Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. Perhaps he's boasting when he states that he had a painter good enough to do the portrait in a day. Or could Browning be saying something about the Duke's appreciation of good art, if the Duke himself is not being sarcastic? The latter prides himself also, not only in collecting beautiful duchesses, but also on correctly reading men's thoughts by the way of their facial expressions. He is arrogant, for he makes it clear that none puts by the curtain I've drawn for you but I. Few dare to ask, but the envoy apparently does. Overweening pride in his 900-old name blinded the Duke to human understanding. Perhaps Chaucer's remark in the Book of the Duchess inspired Browning's famous lines, "She liked whatever, she looked on and her looks went everywhere." The Duke, however, was intensely jealous of the effect upon her of such matters as a beautiful sunset, a bow of trees, the white mule she rode, or chance remarks by the painter, while admitting that it was really petty in him not to tell her how she displeased him. He considered even this trifle of an action stooping, and I choose never to stoop. He gave commands and she soon died. Browning ends the poem with 2 powerful ironic thrusts, the first concerning his next Duchess, and the second concerning both the last Duchess and the next. In the first place, he has the Duke to seize the right to make unlimited just demands for his next Duchess' dowry, though she surely wants it understood that the dear girl herself is what he desires. Then in the second place, as the Duke again magnanimously agrees to go down with the envoy, perhaps even with his arm upon his shoulders, they pause to admire the bronze work by Claus of Innsbruck. Here, Browning admirably wraps up the character of the Duke, the figure of Neptune, mighty god of the sea, taming a weak and defenseless seahorse, the whole of which is cast in bronze. It is a rarity indeed, for why should Neptune, our powerful Duke, with emotions as tender as bronze, tame a seahorse, his weak and relatively defenseless Duchess? A better summation of the cold, unfeeling character of the Duke could hardly have been devised. What clearer indication could the envoy want of the fate in store of the next Duchess? Another interesting feature of the poem is Browning's ability to put believable conversation into heroic couplets. Aside from Alexander Pope, Browning, and perhaps John Dryden, it simply isn't done very well at all. The dramatic monologue as an art form is chiefly valuable for the psychological insights it gives into the character of the speaker in each poem. It is this attribute that should particularly appeal to the 20th century reader. We are drawn to the character's outpouring of soul in an attempt to make sense out of his world at a critical point in his life. In part, our sympathy, amazement, or amusement may be because we have been there ourselves, or have faced the same type of problem, and what we might have fared worse than the speaker in the poem, had we been placed in his precise situation. Of course, the pleasure might also come from a rather foolish sense of superiority we feel over the poor fool in the poem, because we ourselves would never do what he did, until we are tested at least. We can conclude that the period of conscious art arrived with Browning. In the dramatic monologues of this Victorian poet, dramatic occasion and spirit superseded the lyrical, and the style and characterization were greatly improved. As a final word, although the monologue declined after Browning, there have been such examples as Hart's Do Flat and Riley's Nothing to Say, and numerous examples in dialect. So this was all about Robert Browning and the dramatic monologue. If you'd like to know more about another dramatic monologue artist, Alfred Lord Tennyson, have a look at this lecture.